Is your cloud bill out of control? Cloud Zero is building a platform that will let you analyze your cloud investment faster than ever before. You'll get accurate, granular visibility into your total cloud spend without the typical pitfalls of legacy cloud cost management tools like endless tagging or clunky Kubernetes support. Cloud Zero is how cloud-driven companies gain more financial control and predictability by driving immediate and ongoing savings. You can answer questions like, how can I save 20% of my cloud bill right now? Who are my most expensive customers? How much does this specific feature cost our business? Join companies like Rapid7, Drift, and SeatGeek by visiting cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today. Again, please visit cloudzero.com/cloudcast to get started today.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. October 2023 is upon us. We continue to move through the fall, and hope everybody's doing well. Hope the leaves are changing where you're at. It's getting a little chillier. Maybe you're wearing that good warm hoodie, that good flannel, maybe some corduroy pants or a vest or something like that. You know, enjoying this time of year, really the best time of the year, in my opinion. Open to interpretation, but my favorite part of the year. Another Sunday Perspective show, and we're going to dive into a topic. Last week we did a show, request from a listener, request from the community to talk a little bit about job transitions, going through, transition from maybe a individual role to a manager role, a technical role to a less technical role. This week I want to take another listener requested question, and it really is focused on something that I think a lot of people are going through this time of year, although it happens all through the year. And that's the annual review, and kind of looking at what's the best way to navigate the annual review. Can you always trust the feedback that you get from management on that review and that process? And I thought what I would do is sort of dig into that, because the annual review, that process, that relationship you have with your manager, is something that all of us have to go through. But depending on where you are in your career and whether you are on the accepting a review side or giving a review side, can be very, very different. And I've sort of lived through both of those. I mentioned in last week's show that we weren't going to go into any sort of advice giving or sort of suggestions if it wasn't something that Aaron and I have both sort of lived through and sort of been in the middle of. So this is something that both of us have been involved with. So I'm going to kind of dive into both some tips and tricks, some bigger picture things about how the whole process works. For those of you who maybe have done it, I'll kind of highlight some things I've seen at different companies about how they go about doing it. But ultimately, try and give you some strategies to think about in terms of, I guess how to win the annual review, if you will, how to position yourself well, and then maybe from a managerial perspective, how to deal with some of the challenges that are imposed by corporations, by HR departments, by all sorts of things, in terms of trying to position yourself well, but ultimately, hopefully trying to position your teams and your people on your teams well. So we'll get to that after the break. Today's sponsor is Datadog, a real-time monitoring platform that unifies metrics, logs, and distributed traces from your cloud containers and orchestration software. Datadog's container-centric monitoring features allow you to track the health and performance of your dynamic container environment. The container map provides a bird's-eye view of your container fleet, and the live container view searches, groups, and filters your containers with any criteria, like tags, pods, or workspaces. To start monitoring your container clusters, sign up for a free trial today, and Datadog will send you a free t-shirt. Visit datadog.com/container-cloudcast to get started. That's datadog.com/container-cloudcast. And we're back. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, we're going to dive a little bit into kind of both sides of the annual review, which a lot of you have to deal with every year. Most people have to deal with every year, depending on the size of your company. But most of you are going to be typically on one side or the other. You're either going to be still an individual contributor, or even if you are managing a team, you're still getting a review from somebody, as well as if you are managing a team, managing an organization, managing many teams, you're having to give reviews and also manage a much broader process of how the whole system works. So let's dive into some, kind of take this in three parts. Let's take some bigger picture things, kind of how the process works, because obviously it's one thing to just sort of say, well, once a year, the company will give you a review, a score. There's some sort of goals that are met. And then maybe there's some adjustments to, kind of where you stand in the company, whether that's from a title perspective, a compensation perspective. But I want to take this in three chunks. The first chunks will be kind of some bigger picture contextual things that hopefully can help you understand kind of how this broader process works, maybe some tips and tricks around it. Second part we will take is looking at it from a receiving the feedback person. I'll call it an individual contributor, but again, it could be anybody who's receiving the feedback. And then the last part, we'll take a look at it from sort of the manager's perspective, or the people having to give the feedback and sort of work on balancing a number of people within their team. Okay, so let's start with the corporate sort of side of this, the company sort of side of this. Now, the first thing to keep in mind is that this is something that it's a good check and balance for any company to, even if the company is doing extremely well, to be able to not only look at the business, but then look at individuals within the business, because, they're always trying to figure out, can we get better? Are we utilizing people in the best way possible? Do we have the right people in the right positions? Do we have people that might be, good people with good skills in the wrong positions? So, this is something that most companies do. Some of them I've heard will do it multiple times a year, like every 6 months. But typically it's a once a year process, because it is fairly invasive to a lot of people. It's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of paperwork that's involved and all sorts of things. So the second thing to keep in mind, this is ultimately run by the human resources department, or people department, whatever they call it at your company these days. And it's important to keep in mind that while they spend 364 days of the year talking about how they are there to help the employees, the individuals, HR works for the company, right? Keep that in mind. They are there to, try and get the best out of you, do things like build training programs and be sort of the steward of culture and stuff. But when it comes to this process, they are ultimately there to try and make sure, sort of like a labor negotiation, they are essentially there negotiating or representing the corporation, the company, right? They're not necessarily there representing you. And so that's important to kind of keep in mind, because I think far too often people think, oh, okay, HR is trying to take our feedback, and they're running the the company surveys, and they're trying to put these programs in place and whatever it is. And so there's a perception that like they're on your side. And the thing to keep in mind is at the end of the day, they are on the side of the company, right? So they control the process. It's a process that, quite honestly, as somebody who's managed people and managed teams and so forth, it's not necessarily a process that managers are terribly excited about doing, but they know they have to do it every year. Even if their team is having a fantastic year, and you would think, oh, if you're having a fantastic year, you want to get to brag about your team. That's not necessarily the case, because the annual review is not necessarily a brag about your team process. It's a, fit the team into a oftentimes bell curve that's defined by HR. So let's kind of walk through the process. Typically what happens in any given year is the company will have set some sort of goals, company-wide goals. And then typically that filters down at higher levels, down into lower levels, to try and turn into goals that individual employees can match up to. Now, the trick to that is, depending on how you are compensated, and there's all sorts of compensation models out there and all sorts of things that people are compensated on, it's very possible that you don't necessarily have direct goals, at least high-level goals, that impact your compensation. Usually you will be aligned to goals that are kind of company goals. And that makes things a little bit hard, because you might be thinking, well, what could I do to drive $1 billion of revenue, or $10 billion of revenue, or even $50 million of revenue, if you are doing some role in which you're like, well, I'm kind of multiple layers removed from that. But anyways, that's kind of the company framework. Now, the second thing they tend to do is they go, okay, we have to manage people's expectations, and expectations are always, to a certain extent, I should get paid more the next year. That's kind of the employee perspective. I should make more money, and you should promote me if I'm doing good work. That is the sort of constant tension that you'll have from individuals. In some cases, very well merited. In other cases, that's just sort of like, hey, that would be cool if they would just keep paying me more money. And so HR's job in this process is to say, okay, the company will try and reward, people that are doing very well. You'll often hear, we want to reward our best people. We want to reward our best work. What that typically means is that they are going to typically allocate a set of money, however much it might be. It's usually some percentage of the previous year's payroll. So let's say the payroll, just for hypothetical reasons, is $10 million a year. They might say, hey, we are going to allocate 4% more this next year, or some sort of number that is like the cost of living may have gone up because of inflation for some reason, plus some additional amount the company wants to allocate. So maybe it's 10% more or something along those lines. Then what essentially happens is typically anywhere in the company, that amount of money will sort of be allocated to individual teams. So let's say, for example, your team is allocated some chunk of money. And then what HR typically does in terms of guidelines is they will tell managers, well, I want you to try and allocate, they'll often tell them you have the ability to go allocate how you want to in terms of redoing this, but you also have to keep in certain guidelines. We would like you to try and allocate more of it towards your best people, because ultimately, if you are compensating your best people, the thought process is those people are more likely to stay, and they're already proving that they're doing the most impactful work. The people that are just kind of doing what they intended, what they were supposed to do, sort of what they would call average workers, maybe you don't have to necessarily change their thing. And then people that maybe are underperforming, maybe you make some sort of adjustment to that. So it ends up looking sort of like a bell curve. They tend to say, well, reward the most rewards to your top 10%. Maybe you're offering rewards down to maybe your top 25%, and then sort of, leaving the status quo in place for everybody else. Right. So it's an interesting process because, there's a defined amount of money. There's not necessarily a defined sort of change in terms of titles or in terms of promotions or something like that. And they basically sort of dictate to you, well, this is how we want you to allocate it. And so that's sort of the framework of how that works, right? The second thing that you have to sort of understand, so that's sort of the process, and you have to understand the process is that it will, it sort of filters its way down to individual teams, and then it sort of filters its way back up. So it's typically top down and then bottom up, and it has to kind of get rationalized around that. So the second thing that can happen is at any given team, they may believe that they deserve more of that money, but as it sort of filters its way back up to a more higher level person, a vice president, a senior vice president, some C-level person, they may feel like, well, I need to sort of balance things better, right? So it's always this sort of ebb and flow, give and take. Okay, so that's the framing of this thing. It's perceived as a very big process, but it ends up sort of fitting into these sort of well-defined models, which are skewed towards the people that are deemed to be the highest performing people, because that's the ones they'd like to keep around. Now, as an individual, you should be looking at this process not as, okay, they told us the process is kicking off, and over the next 3 or 4 weeks, we're going to have to fill out some paperwork and submit some things to our boss, and they're going to kind of figure it out, and then there'll be the sort of annual review you have with them. The way you should look at this from experience is you should look at this as an annual process, like an ongoing year-long process. And by that, I mean, you should do the best you can once goals for the year are set out to try and take those high-level goals and make them things that are tangible to you, things that you can connect the dots with, not just, well, we're some group and we're supposed to feed into this and we're supposed to do that, but you want to try and have some tangibility that you can sit down with your boss and go, does this feel like the ways that, what we're working on, what I'm working on, lead us to these things? And again, you're not going to get exact answers all the time, especially if, you're in a role that isn't sort of firsthand touching the company goals. So for example, if the company goals are drive this much revenue and you're maybe not in sales, for example, you might be like, well, how do I drive revenue? I'm over here in this marketing organization, or I'm in this logistics organization. Right. So that makes it harder, second degree, third degree, and so forth. But you want to try and sort of connect some dots there, right? So it gives you some ways early in the year to sit with your manager and say, hey, are we doing the things that look aligned to that? And that's hopefully something that your whole team is trying to do. Now, the second thing you want to try and do as part of this sort of year-long process is you not only want to make sure that you have some visibility up to your boss, and you want to do that on a regular basis, something you want to keep track of, because keep in mind, let's say your boss has 10 or 12 people that report to them, which isn't unusual, or maybe your boss's boss has 100 people that report to them. Keeping track of everybody is difficult, especially when you're not just keeping track of sort of like, work output or numbers or whatever, but like highlights. That's difficult for them, right? They've got a lot on their plate as well. They've got a lot of things going on. So you need to be sort of the scribe of your own year, right? Think of yourself as the highlight writer for your own year. Like what did you do well? But more importantly, what are the highlights? What are the important things? Not the, hey, we met all these deadlines, or hey, I sent this thing out once a week, but what are the highlights, right? That's the second thing that you want to kind of own, and you want to be doing it throughout the year. Something that's often useful is, have a shared document with you and your manager that you're just keeping track of stuff, so that there's never any ambiguity about like, hey, what are we doing well, or even what are we doing poorly? And then you can sort of, showcase throughout the year, like, hey, this thing that was red at one point became yellow, became green. Second thing, so be the scribe of your own year, if you will, the highlight writer. The third thing, and this is probably the most important thing, is you need to be figuring out how is what you're working on visible beyond your boss. And by that, what I mean is what's going to happen is at some point in time, your boss, your manager, and the other peer managers that they have are going to have to get together, and their boss is going to have to rationalize some things. Like, why are we allocating this much money towards this person? Or, hey, out of 100 people, we might have 5 promotions that we think we can give to people. Who do we think those people can be? And typically the very first thing that happens during that process is candidates will be put forward. Your boss might be trying to, advocate for you, which is awesome. But what they're ultimately going to have to do is go, Mike or Sam or Sally or whoever it might be, did this awesome thing. They were awesome this year. And the first thing that'll happen is the other managers will either go, yep, I'm very aware of them. They were helpful. I have visibility to what they do. I know my team talked about them. Or they're going to go, I guess. I don't know who that person is. And the last thing you want to happen is for them to go, I don't know who that person is. Because ultimately what that means is either you or your manager aren't making what you're doing visible to them. They're not giving you opportunities to become visible outside of the small scope of what you're working on. And ultimately, while you may be the best person on your team or one of the best people on your team, if you're not ultimately doing work that eventually becomes visible outside of your team, the ability for you to get things like promotions and opportunities and other things is going to be fairly limited. So one of the things that you want to be asking your boss throughout the process, and that you want to be doing actively yourself, is figuring out, how do I do things that are visible outside of our team? You want to do the best job you can within your team, but begin to be visible outside of your team. How are you communicating with other teams? How are you helping those other teams? What are you doing to be visible to your manager, but also their peer managers as well, right? And that doesn't mean you have to be, some big sort of, kiss butt person, that kiss up person to all these things. But you do want to be doing work that's impactful, that other teams are like, yep, it's really important that you are doing that work, or that we're able to piggyback on that work to be able to do the thing that they want to do. So that's really, really important. So again, think of the process as a long process, a year-long process. Communication is key. Keeping track of things and visibility and transparency of what you've been doing is key. And then getting outside of your circle, outside of your bubble, is very, very key. Now, the second part of the individual thing, and this was one of the things that the person who asked us to talk about this said, is they said, hey, can you talk about a little bit about how you can't always trust your manager. You can't always trust that they have your best interest in mind. And they used a couple of sports analogies that I think I'd love to use in the show, but unfortunately, since the show's global, and some of the analogies aren't going to necessarily work for all of you. But they made a good point. They said, you want to be conscious of the fact that maybe your boss, your manager, isn't necessarily going to be giving you the best advice for you, right? And they made a couple of examples. They said, if let's say you're in a startup and you're talking to the CEO and they're trying to give you advice, it's important to keep in mind that CEO's trying to do the best thing for their company. But if you're all in on the company, that advice might align very, very well. But there's also going to be times when, they are going to have a certain vision, a certain perspective on things that may not necessarily be where you want to be 2 years from now, 3 years from now, 4 years from now, right? They're only focused on this quarter and next quarter and getting this product out the door. And so, even if you get a chance to talk to a very senior person, you do want to kind of have a certain grain, take it with a certain grain of salt that you're getting feedback often from them, from their perspective, what's going to make their life better. And you kind of have to balance that with, okay, that makes sense. It's probably a little shorter term. It might not be, in the best interest of where you want to be 2 jobs from now, or 5 years from now, or 3 or 4 years from now. It's really kind of, 1 year short-sightedness. So, again, keep that in mind. The other thing to keep in mind, and they highlight this as another thing to keep in mind, is oftentimes we say, hey, you should find mentors. You should find people that can help guide you later in your career. And that's very good advice. Sometimes the person you find as a mentor is somebody who's in the next level job as you. Sometimes it's somebody that you meet in the industry that's maybe, 10 years older or 15 years older. But I think the one thing in this, the person who highlighted this makes a very good point. You do want to kind of take their feedback with, again, a grain of salt, because especially as the industry changes and as things are starting to change faster and faster, and, you want to kind of ask for the context of like, well, why are you giving me advice? Was that kind of specific to what you learned or you experienced 10 or 15 years ago? Was that kind of only specific to the company that you were at the time? And the whole point of this is that you can oftentimes have great mentorship, but when they're only relating their experience to you, that experience, while it might be useful, might also be somewhat dated, right? If the industry's not still doing those sort of behaviors, or those things aren't rewarded the way they used to be, you kind of want to go, okay, I'm going to be respectful of that, but I also, have to take that with a grain of salt. Like maybe, again, that might not be still the best way to do it. So those things are very, very important, right? Anytime you're taking advice from people about what to do next, finding mentorship, even getting counsel from, CEO or senior vice president or vice president or somebody like that, again, think about their oftentimes, their perspective is oftentimes, hey, yes, this would be good for you, but it might be better for them. And you're trying to find that balance. So again, keep that in mind. Okay. So those are a few things in terms of, think of it as a longer process, be transparent, communicate well, get outside of your bubble, and take advice with a grain of salt. Now, from a manager perspective, so you have to manage the process on behalf of your team and behalf of other people. So this is one of these situations in which, I talked about at the beginning, HR wants to be your friend for 364 days a year, and then they feel like your enemy for the 365th day of year. Because what happens is, as a manager, you are guided, to be part of the team, help align to goals, and those are absolutely the things you should be doing, right? Like work with your leadership team, get your teams aligned to the team goals. Don't be that person who, is always kind of second guessing leadership and so forth. It's fine to argue with leadership, but keep in mind that AWS principle of like, we're going to disagree, but when it comes time to agree, even if we have some disagreement still, we're going to set that disagreement aside and we're going to march forward. We're going to find the best way to do that, because, you're not always going to find a solution that is perfect for every group that's part of some goal. But you can't have groups that are, ongoingly sort of being, dissident to those goals, right? So as a manager, hopefully you've worked out whatever the goals are for the year, and you're pushing your team. You're pushing them to be the best they can. You're pushing them hard to get the goals that are oftentimes feel unreachable at the beginning. You start to chip away at them. You start to make progress. And depending on what you're working on, if you're working on things that are very forward-looking and sort of tip of the spear kind of things, or you're working on things that are more mainstream, more kind of cash cow parts of the businesses, more steady state types of things. Either way, you're trying to get the best out of your people. You're trying to get the best results from your team, and you're pushing your team very, very hard. And while you might realize that like some of the people on your team are better than others, it might be because of seniority, it might be because of pay levels, but you're pushing your team the whole year of like, we're a team, we're doing the best we can. And then you get to the annual review process, and HR wants you to go stack rank people. It wants you to, even if you had 10 rock stars on your team, they only want you to reward one of them because maybe you're only rewarding 10% of the team with some sort of, better compensation. So that's a very, very hard part of the process is that, again, 364 days a year, you're pushing, you're trying to get the best out of everybody. You're trying to encourage them. You're trying to, find the best people. And then that 365th day of year, when the annual review kind of comes and you have to put your final numbers in, you're then sort of like, oh yeah, well, only 10% of the team's good, 70% of it's average, and 10% of it's really, kind of falling behind the curve. And that's a hard thing to do because, when it comes time to talking to those people, you're essentially like, yeah, I know what I said, but it's the HR process, it's the review process, so you got to fit in the box somewhere. You got to fit in a silo somewhere, and so that's a really hard thing to do as a manager. It sucks as an individual too to hear that sort of things of like, wait a minute, I'm just average. I thought we were kicking butt all year long, and so that is again, from an employee's perspective, an individual contributor's perspective, where you have to be pushing as hard as you can. You have to be giving your boss as much evidence and ammunition as they possibly can have and best use, sort of usage models. And as a boss, you're doing the best you can, but you're also sort of stuck in the, hey, I got to make people fit in a box. Now, I will give a couple of tips and tricks, having been on this, on both sides of sort of good and bad in the management thing. One of the things that I found over time was you're oftentimes early when you're a manager, you're like, oh, okay, it stinks that I've had this good team and I'm having to kind of put them in a box and kind of do this stuff. So I'm going to kind of be a good sort of manager. I'm going to make my boss's life easy, and I'm just going to kind of make the numbers fit. I'm not going to push that hard. I'm going to kind of make the numbers fit. And what I found was you really do want to push. You want to be the person who tries to overrank, especially if you can back it up with numbers. You can back it up with your team achieved certain things. You almost want to overrank your people, right? You want to advocate on behalf of your people above and beyond, because you have to realize that at some point you're going to have to justify them again, like I said, with other managers and up a higher level or up multiple levels. So oftentimes, as best you can, if you think you have teams that are skewed to the right of the normal sort of bell curve, you want to sort of advocate for that. You want to push very hard for that. You want to, put in, hey, we really should be getting 130% of the budget that we were allocated for, 120% of the budget. So now you may get pushed back on that. But that's sort of one thing I learned is that those who don't sort of push the boundaries on those sort of things, those that just sort of fall in line are always going to only get the stuff they gave them. In fact, in some cases, if you don't sort of advocate for your team or push for them, oftentimes the process will come back and go, well, I know you're at 100% and you sort of match the thing perfectly, but I'm going to have to ask you for less. I'm going to have to ask you for 90% because somebody else advocated really well and they're getting 110%. They're getting 120%, 130%, right? So again, the first thing is, push your teams to achieve whatever they can. When it comes to the HR process, push if you have the justification for it, you can make the case for it. Your team is well recognized. Push for more. Push for 110, 120, 130%. Because again, it comes top down to you. You're going to push back bottom up, and you're going to try and sort of fight for that within that process. And you'll be surprised at how many teams, that's because they have good managers, because they have good relationships up the managerial chain, because they're getting results done, oftentimes consistently are at 120%, 130%, 110%, whatever it might be. So that's sort of the first thing that I learned the hard way a couple of times at different teams is I didn't push hard enough. The second thing is as a manager, you need to be thinking, again, throughout the year, who are people on your team that probably should be up for promotions, right? And this is where different teams, different companies have different kind of criteria for promotions. In some cases, promotions are used as a recognition after somebody has been sort of doing above and beyond their job, almost doing the next level job for a period of time, and then they're recognized for that and they're given that promotion. Other companies, they're given a promotion because they're shown potential, and then the next sort of level of expectations grows on them, right? So you want to sort of understand that, but as a manager, you want to be looking at your team and going, okay, where are these people in terms of doing really good work? Where are they in terms of, potentially staying and leaving or really making big contributions to your company? And where are they in terms of they're pushing you? They're telling you, I want to do more. I'm willing to take on more. I'm capable of doing more, or you think that's possible with them. And you want to be thinking throughout the year, what can I do to get them visibility? Because again, as I mentioned earlier on in the individual contributor side, that visibility is as important as anything to getting people promoted, to getting people raises and those things. Because if you're not advocating on their behalf, if you're not giving them opportunities to be visible, maybe they're going to sit in with you on status meetings. Maybe they're going to run a project that maybe, would have been maybe years if you had enough time to do it, but you gotta be thinking about that. And you want to start doing that early in the year, because you want to give them multiple sort of bites at the apple, if you will, right? So that's something that as a manager, you need to be thinking about throughout the year. You want to be probably thinking about, who are the number of people that are potentially open for this? Maybe it's multiple people. And then I think it's communicating with people throughout the year. Yeah, we're going to try and, you and I are going to be on this track together. We're going to try and put you on this path to getting promoted, to having visibility, to doing the things that we need to do. And you're not overpromising something, right? You're saying, look, I can't guarantee everything because, again, the HR process doesn't necessarily let that happen. But as a good manager, that's something that you ought to be pushing very hard for and communicating with your people and figuring out, are you willing to do the things to take that next step? What can you do to show me that you're capable of that next step, right? And oftentimes the promotion process is multiple cycles, right? Like you may challenge somebody to try to take that next level. They may think they're ready to take that next level. You may give them a number of experiences and opportunities to get there, and they may not be ready to get there as fast as you thought, right? Maybe it's harder than you thought. Maybe they, when they're put in those leadership positions, don't perform the way they need to, but it's a learning opportunity. It's a mentorship opportunity. And that second time they do it, they figure it out. Or that third time they do it, they figure that out. So that's where, as a good manager, you want to be putting them in opportunities to succeed. You want to be putting them in opportunities to be visible. You want to be advocating on their behalf. But again, you also want to be, realistic with them of not everybody gets promoted every single time just because you said you're going to happen, right? Like I said, if 5 or 10% of the group is going to get promoted on a regular basis, and some other team has a bunch of people that have been in line, have been doing great work as well, that's where they may not all get promoted, and you have to sort of manage those expectations as well. So, anyways, I tried to hit on a few things. I didn't obviously hit on everything, but the annual review again. A couple of things to keep in mind. I'll summarize this real quick. It's an HR process, right? It is part of what the company does, but it does feel like it's sort of fights sometimes against what the company's trying to do. Sometimes it feels like it fights against the company culture. This is where understanding the bigger process is really important, right? Just expecting that it's going to be great for everybody is the wrong way to look at it. As an individual, you want to look at it as a year-long process. You want to communicate well. You want to communicate your goals. You want to be making sure that, as best you can, you have some clear ideas. I think the other thing is to realize that, things are going to change throughout the year, and you want to be, if you're having those regular communications with your boss, you're dealing with those changes and you're documenting them well. Maybe the goals for the company changed. Maybe a project you were working on, some bigger thing came up, right? And so, you want to be doing that. As a manager, you want to be, advocating for your team. You want to be giving your employees the opportunity to do those things that are visible, and you need to be pushing them, right? You don't want to set an example that like, hey, we're going to be the group that everybody gets promoted in, and because you're going to set them up for failure, right? At some point, it can happen for a short period of time, but it doesn't happen all the time. So lots of give and take in the process. The better you understand the whole process, the better. The more you understand the trade-offs and the amount of communication involved, the amount of leadership needed, the amount of sort of negotiation needed, the better off everybody ends up being. Now, everybody doesn't always get everything they want out of it, but I think understanding the bigger picture of it is really, really important. So hopefully some of that was useful. I'm not going to do workplace advice all the time, but we did get a couple of good questions back to back, and I thought they'd be interesting to answer. So hopefully last week's show and this week's show are useful to folks at different stages of their career. I know Aaron and I have been through these. We've had these discussions within ourselves for the last 15, 20 years. Him and I have known each other. So anyways, thanks to all for listening. Hope you're having a great Sunday, having a great weekend whenever you're listening to the show. Thanks for listening to the show every week. Thanks for telling a friend. Thanks for giving us 5-star reviews on Google and Apple and Spotify and all the different places that you listen to it. And with that, I'll wrap it up and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.